whatever it is we're speaking about, the purpose, the cause, the goal, the ultimate ask, with something personal in ourselves, and speak from that place where even more powerful and even more convincing. And I knew that, and I felt like there was a disconnect. So I went to acting school because I figured the actors have this instrument. That's what they always refer to it as, an instrument. And that's exactly what they're able to do. They're able to they're trained in how to find something within themselves that resonates with this character and their situation, and the language and the emotion comes from there, from something very genuine and authentic inside of them. And I just wanted that, so I went to acting school, and I really honed that skill.
Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome Deroy, CEO of Narrative.
And I'm Julienne B. Ryan, and it's great to be back.
Yes, great to see you. And before we move on to introducing our guest, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast wherever you find those. Leave a review as well, and check out our YouTube channel where we post all these episodes as well. And you'll be able to find lots of information in the episode notes today, as well as on narrative.com/podcast, where you can also find all our previous episodes. So today our guest is Jennifer Gardner, a Los Angeles-based trial lawyer, persuasive communications educator, and part-time administrative law judge. She specializes in strategic, empathic, and persuasive communication, with a focus on high performers in various settings. When she's not lawyering, she educates high-performing leaders on how to grow their executive presence and confidence using persuasive communication strategies through her program, The Art of Influence and the Power Lab, and for various continuing legal education providers. She also consults with lawyers on strategic messaging for their cases and helps them with their courtroom presence. Jennifer's career spans entertainment litigation, serious criminal cases, and business and real estate disputes. She's trained at the Trial Lawyers College, the Jerry Spence Method, and the Wharton School. Jennifer, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
It's so good to be here. Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. I'm very curious about these concepts of power and influence, and how did that become the focus of your work?
Well, I actually think it's been the focus of my work since even before law school. I always felt like I had a cause, a personal cause, some kind of injustice that I needed to correct. And I sort of married that with a inborn ability for telling stories. My mother will tell you that I've been telling stories since I was born. I just always knew where to embellish, how to make it sound, even more heart-wrenching. And I used them all the time to get what I wanted, even as a child. So that to just answer your question, it's really difficult to say. I think it's been almost all the time. And then it became even more critical that I figure it out once I became a lawyer and I was dealing with very serious problems for individuals.
Yeah.
Was there a moment, because sometimes when you have that skill and it's innate and it's so much part of your fiber, we kind of lose sight of it. We know it's something special, but we think anybody can do this or other people do it. There must have been a moment when you were sitting either in law school or in the practical world when you start to apply, where you went, this is something I have, and this is what's interesting. Is there a case that you can point to, that you can describe?
A case.
Or an
Yeah.
example.
Many. I mean, when I first started practicing law, I was in a firm environment and I bounced around for the first few years, and I was very unhappy working in law firms because I felt like even though I had a lot to learn, I wasn't really working as a lawyer. It's very difficult to explain. And then I would go to court, and some lawyers would absolutely captivate me with how incredibly magnetic and charismatic they were. And then others weren't. And I couldn't understand what the difference was. And then what happened was I got my first few cases, and I got them where I had to try the case on my own because I wasn't in a firm anymore. So I got the experience that I was looking for. And while I was preparing those cases to go to trial, I had this shocking realization that I had no idea how to try a case. And the only thing that I knew how to do was how to tell a story and how to connect with the emotional dynamics of the case and the relationships between the parties and the psychological dynamics that sort of fueled the dispute and that was underlying everything. And the only thing I knew how to do was to go into a courtroom and tell that story in a very emotionally compelling way. It was completely instinctive. We're talking 30 years ago. I mean, really completely instinctive. Nobody said, this is how you do it. And
Mhm.
I was shocked when I won case after case after case. And I was not a legal genius. I didn't know the rules of evidence. I was still learning the rules of civil procedure. And here I was winning my cases. I mean, we're talking about unanimous jury verdicts for fraud. I mean, crazy verdicts that I never expected in a million years that I would get. And I looked at what I was doing and I understood why. And I remember once I had a criminal case where I was defending a woman who had been accused of child endangerment, and we won the case. I was shocked. She was crying and I was completely shocked when we heard the verdict. And in the hallway, on the way to the elevators, the jurors were mingling outside the elevators and we were all standing there at the same time. And my client said, thank you. And thank you so much. And the woman, a few of them were standing together, and one of them said to her, anything we can do to help. And I thought, wow, there really is, if I can make people feel like they want to help my client, I'm doing something right.
Mm.
Yeah.
And of course, I had no idea what that really was, but I knew instinctively I'm doing something right. And it was the same experience repeatedly. So I relied on that skill set. I still rely on that skill set. I still read the law and I still prepare my case from a factual, but I had an emotional approach to preparing the case for a trial or a hearing or a
Mm.
deposition.
Yeah, it's interesting you just used that word, the emotional approach, because that's kind of what struck me as well in that story
Mm.
you just told us. And thanks for sharing that, because it really brings to life the concept of, many concepts actually, but especially I think of influencing and that emotional connection that, we get from hearing it, from listening to a story, just very simply. And so it's really fascinating to hear how that, how you sort of transferred that to that innate response that we all have to listening to a story, which is that it kind of tugs at the heartstrings, as well as, stimulating our brain and our mind because it's giving us information, right? And I love that example because the jurors clearly were moved, and they were moved to say, not just give you the verdict that was needed, but also, what else do you need? How can we help? That's pretty extraordinary. And that's something we see a lot in our business in terms of on kind of the organizational level, that people will tell stories and we'll coach them to do this for fundraising and things like that. And it's a similar idea that at the end of it, if your prospective donor or your prospective buyer is saying not just I want to buy your product or I want to fund this, but also how much more can I do? What's the additional help? I think that's the value add of a story. And you've just put it beautifully through that case, so through that example. And I guess so the question that I'm now finally getting to, because that was all a comment, but I really appreciate that example. The question is really about influencing, because I know that's a big part of what you've designed here with the Power Lab in particular. But I'm curious about that idea. So in this case, you clearly saw that, it was brought to life. You saw the power of storytelling and adding that to your considerable skills as a lawyer. But then, where does the sort of the transfer happen with influencing? Can you tell us a little bit more about the concept of influencing and how storytelling helps with that?
Absolutely. Influencing or influence is, I think it's the Webster's dictionary definition of power. You have
Mm,
power when you're able to influence, and vice versa. When you can influence, you have power. And
mm,
yes. And so I'm um, consumed basically with how different people working in different professions and in different fields can do that. And um, it's primarily I study even the neuroscience behind it, like what
mm,
happens in our brain when we are being influenced and when we are influencing others. And basically, what we're doing is we're connecting on an emotional level. We're
mm,
piercing through the left brain and we're getting through to the right brain where the decisions are made. And that's where the firing of the emotions occurs without getting too technical about the structure of the brain. Because even though I love to read about neuroscience, I am not a neuroscientist. I just understand generally how it works. And the experts all seem to agree. So it's this when you tell a story, there's a couple of things that are happening. First of all, if you start by saying, let me tell you a story, you're automatically triggering in the brain a trance like state. And you're making people more suggestible. So they're being moved into this situation where they're more receptive to listening to what it is you have to say. And the reason why the science proves that the reason why this happens is because when we're children, most parents read bedtime stories and we associate this relaxed state with listening to a story and falling asleep, right? And as we fall asleep, our subconscious increases or our unconscious increases and our conscious mind decreases. And there are psychologists, psychiatrists who will say that most of our lives are the way that they are because of the power of our unconscious mind. So,
mm,
story, when we say to people, I want to tell you a story, has a way of triggering this trance like state where we are more suggestible. And that's before
mm,
you even get to the story, right? Then you can get to the
mm.
story and you have even more potential to influence people. Um, so I think, did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Because I'm
it's
not.
fascinating because it's kind of like hypnosis, right? And I know that
Yes.
we've I've because of our work in teaching people how to tell a story in particular, um, you know, one of the major steps that we have is concerns listening. And how do you prepare your listening? How do you create an optimal listening environment so that stories can emerge? And I
Mm,
think just the what you said beautifully connects with this when you said, all you have to do essentially is say, I'm going to tell you a story, and immediately that creates something for the listener. It prepares their mind for something, and it is a little bit like hypnosis. I mean, it's like telling you, because the way hypnosis works actually is that first you are told you're going to be hypnotized. It doesn't, there's no coercion or anything like that. You're told you're being hypnotized, you're told how it's going to happen, and the fact that you are taking this in, you're already being hypnotized. So by the time there's a snap of fingers or a pendulum, whatever it is, you're already hypnotized. And
mhm.
so it's a kind of a similar thing. And I hadn't connected those things. So thank you for that, because for me, it's very clear that yes, just the simple act of saying, I am now ready to tell you a story, it kind of immediately puts me in that position of the little boy, right? Who's sort of like, oh, yay, I can kind of relax into this, but not relax to the point that I'm not stimulated. I'm actually very stimulated by that, right? My
Yeah.
brain is going. It's like it's anticipating what the story's going to be, and what's going
Right.
to be revealed and all of that. So yeah, no, I think that makes total sense to me.
I was speaking in front of a group a couple weeks ago, and I did the let me tell you a story. I did my introductory remarks, and then I was let me tell you a story. And people were like, ah, just like you were describing. And then they were like, I took them on a real journey of highs and lows and ups and downs and challenges and setbacks and triumphs, right? And it was my story. And watching them listen and nodding their heads and, the reaction. I
Yeah.
had as much fun watching them listen to me as I did just telling the story.
Yeah,
But,
sure.
humans are also, I mean, we've evolved through storytelling. So much of our history was passed down verbally through stories before we even had the ability to write and record what was happening. And so, we have this rich storytelling uh, capacity and receptiveness built into our brains. So
Mm,
that's another thing that
mm,
we simply can't discount.
mhm,
So I want to double back just for a moment to the example you gave in the vestibule by the elevators in the courtroom. So I can visually picture what that looks like, having been in situations going to court or, being supporting people. The story brings the humanity, and while you're telling it, our brains are firing up on all levels. It's not just taking the left brain information, and that and because of what you mentioned, the emotions, it gets locked into the primitive part of our brain. So I may forget your story for a bit. A couple of weeks from now, it'll go out of my hand. And then there's going to be a situation where somebody says
mm,
lawyer, client, I advocated, and I'll be listening to them, but I'll also remember what you shared. So that is also the power of it, just gets locked into the memory to be unpacked in a very special way when we need it. So your humanity and then powering them with your story into an ask. What can we
mm.
can do? I think that was a very important lesson. So the ask is your action, not just, oh, that was nice. Let me go now. Go to another meeting. You're looking for an action to happen.
100%.
Yeah, and you
100%.
know what's interesting about that too is that I'm just getting this now, is that the result, that you're looking for as a lawyer is a verdict, is the verdict that you're looking for, right? And so, and you got that, and then the thing that you weren't expecting was this sort of very human, um, impulse to say, how else can we help, right? That was a complete surprise, and it's not necessarily something you can sort of plan for. And I think that's a really important piece, that we all have these goals, and the people always talk about the call to action when they're presenting, pitching, trying to influence somebody, persuade, whatever. And as part of your story, you must have the call to action, right? And while that's completely true, and of course you should have that, I think there's also a part that needs to be open to maybe that call to action. Say it for sure, but be open to whatever else might arise as a call to action for your audience that you didn't even think about, right? Your client did not think about, hey, I'm going to ask these jurors to help me, right? Beyond this trial, beyond this verdict. And yet when she received that,
Mm.
and the reason she received it was because she said thank you, right? So there was kind of there's always this two-way street. And I think it's a really good message for everybody who's listening, that when you're done doing that presentation, that pitch, whatever it is, um, don't just leave the room. Stick around, talk to people, thank them, be grateful, etc., and then see what comes back to you, right? Even if you even if you got that verdict, you didn't just leave. You were there in the vestibule, and there they were.
Mhm.
Sure, some of it is chance, but I mean, your client then decided, you know what, they're here, I'm just going to thank them. Take that opportunity, because you don't know what's going to come back, and usually what comes back is very positive.
So when
Usually.
you met us, you were telling this host of skills that you were an incredible learner and you added improv and acting and a whole bunch of things to your skill set, besides your classical long term. Tell us a little bit about that because I just think that it's never just one thing that gets us to where we need to be, and
Mm.
it creates a multi-dimensional capacity to be in your those moments that you're in. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, it's a great question. I went through advanced trial skills training after 20 years of practicing law.
Mm.
And while I learned great skills and I was using them and getting good results, I felt like there was more. There was a piece that was missing for me that I needed to
Hmm.
work on still. So I'm not complaining about the education. I'm complaining about where I was at in my journey to absorb and integrate all this information. And it had to do with, I mean, I went through this training and I had all these great skills, and they were like tools like a screwdriver and a wrench and a drill, right? For example, I needed to be able to connect them with something inside me while I was speaking, because I really do believe that when we can ground whatever it is we're speaking with about the purpose, the cause, the goal, the ultimate ask with something personal in ourselves, and speak from that place, we're even more powerful and even more convincing. And I knew that, and I felt like there was a disconnect. So I went to acting school
Mm.
because I figured the actors have this instrument. That's what they always refer to it as, an instrument. And that's exactly what they're able to do. They're able to find, they're trained in how to find something within themselves that resonates with this character and their situation, and the language and the emotion comes from there, from something very genuine and authentic inside of them. And I just wanted that. So I went to acting school and
Okay.
I really honed that skill. I was
Mm.
doing it before, again, instinctively. I think everybody does this to a certain extent instinctively, but I wanted to do it professionally. Now, it turns out I'm a terrible actor because I can't memorize lines. I'm great at improv, right? But I'm terrible at memorizing lines. So I didn't pursue that. And I had no plans to pursue that to be an actor professionally. I just wanted that skill for when I was speaking. And now it's become, I mean, of course, I'm very aware of the need to do that when I'm speaking, but it's like a muscle, and the
Mm.
muscle is a lot stronger because I work it out all the time. I work it out
Mm.
all the time
Mm.
in every conversation and every communication, whether it's with a prospective client, an existing client, an opposing counsel, a judge, a jury, um, when I'm speaking publicly. I'm always trying to ground and connect with that emotional side of myself that relates to the kernel of what it is I'm trying to say, whether it's for somebody else or for myself.
I think that's so interesting because a lot of times when people hear story or use story in your meetings we do for coaching or change management, they think you're asking someone to do a robotic rendition of a speech. Here's the first line, here's the last line, like almost like David Mamet would want if you're doing theater, like do not, do not, pivot from the script, or like a commercial where they've been curating these words so everything hits a point at the exact time. There's no improv in commercials. And I think what you're here is saying to everybody is you're going to have to use your own energy in that moment. You know what to do with your body, you know what to do with your facts, but you're going to have to react and have a in-person conversation with the group that you're addressing with, whether it be a jury or your client, your new client.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And what you said just made me realize that so many times when high performers need to present, they forget the emotional piece of it. They're
Mhm.
really up in their heads. They're focusing on the technical. They want to come off as proficient and competent and qualified. And they leave out, how am I going to connect with the people that I'm speaking to so that they know who I am? Right. And we have to merge the two. We have to be able to merge the two, I think, in order to be
Mm.
our
Yes.
most effective and bring ourselves our true selves into the communication.
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting because that links back to a question I was thinking about before we started recording here, and that is, what would you say are the kind of essential ingredients, let's say, for, this is a leadership podcast geared towards leaders or people that are becoming or have the ambition of becoming leaders in whatever field they're in. And so I'm curious about your take on those ingredients for becoming an influential, persuasive leader, because I know that's kind of what you focus on, and you've just given us a little clue there with this idea of connection and your true self. But I don't want to speak for you, and so curious if that is included in those ingredients, and maybe you can elaborate on that.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, I've read the literature, but the literature confirmed what I knew on an instinctive level just from being out in the trenches, on the ground, trying to influence and persuade other people. And that is that leaders, the best leaders, have a lot of EQ. Their EQ is perhaps even greater than their IQ in some cases. It's their emotional intelligence. So they listen deeply, which you've been speaking about, the whole issue of listening deeply. And they're able to speak in language and in terms and vernacular and emotional content that resonates on a really deep level with their listeners, that gets their listeners to respond in the way that they want them to, quite frankly, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So leaders are getting people to follow them.
Mm. Yeah.
And so emotional intelligence, there are, as I know you guys know, many components of emotional intelligence. And one of them is empathy. And empathy, I believe, is sharpened through very deep listening. And also, I believe it's sharpened through really slowing down so that we can listen to ourselves, because we can't really understand other people unless we first deeply understand ourselves. So I think it helps to be an emotional person and to have access to your own feelings, to be
Mm.
sensitive. But so many high performers feel like they have to just cut that part of themselves off when they enter whatever the playing field is that they're stepping onto, when they're
Mm.
trying to do what it is that they need to do. And what's worked for me for years, and what I now am constantly practicing cultivating in myself, is a marriage between the two, so that I'm speaking from this very authentic, personal, genuine space where Jennifer, the human, is very present in this conversation while she's speaking about maybe some very complex or weighty concepts. And that's the only way that I found that you could get people truly to pay attention and to care. And if you can spin it in a way that really resonates with whatever their personal issues are, or their team's issues, or whatever the context, then you're going to get buy-in for your ideas. So emotional intelligence, there's so much to emotional intelligence, as I'm sure you also know. There's the ability to regulate your own feelings while you're doing this. So it's not just opening up the tap of
Mm.
emotion and letting it flow. You have to be able to regulate it. So it's using it strategically.
Mm.
And then there are many other things that are probably way beyond the scope of our chat today, but definitely, to be a great leader, to be influential and persuasive, you need to cultivate your EQ skills as much as you need your IQ skills.
Mm. I love that.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I want to get to the question that we ask all of our guests, and then I've got one more question after that, and I'm sure, Julian, you've got some questions too. But I want to make sure we get to this question, which is the one we ask of all of our guests. And I'd like to ask this to you now, which is, what is an experience that has shaped who you are today? We've heard lots of different kind of snippets of experiences, but I'd love to hear about one experience that might have shaped who you are today, still continues to influence you.
Hmm. Well, there are so many. I will, it's hard to choose, quite
Yeah.
honestly. I will go with when I was doing social documentary photography.
Mm.
I was studying photography, and I did a project. My very first project was I photographed homeless kids and punks in Hollywood, and I grew up in Hollywood, so I went onto the street and approached these kids and asked if I could take their pictures in their environment. And that I formed on the very first day a very powerful relationship with these two young women, one of whom I'm still in touch with, and the other one I haven't spoken to in several years. But um, they basically led me into this underworld, which was really pretty scary, actually, when I think about it, looking back at it now. But that's how I got access to this population. I gained their trust.
Mm.
And how I gained their trust was by showing up. The deal was, I'll take your picture and next week I'll bring you a print. Same time,
Mm.
same place. I'll meet you here with a print. And I did that for 9 months, almost every week. And then I had a great show of that work in Japan and here in Los Angeles. And I showed it in Mexico. I've shown it several places around the world and domestically. So it was a big, successful thing for me. And I learned from doing that. Well, let me back up and say that I found myself in some really sketchy, scary situations with
Mm.
some really frightening people. And there were times when I was really frightened, and the two young women who had led me into this world had my back, and I really trusted that they had my back. And because of the relationships that I was able to form with the people in their community, I felt very protected most of the time. But there were times where it was just so um, awful.
Mm.
And what I learned from that experience was how to survive and how to navigate in this kind of a culture, which is profound. The survival skill that's required is an authenticity. There's a code of conduct and a code of honor that these people, as crazy as their lives may be and as different as they may look from ours, um, being people with regular residence addresses and tax-paying citizens and all of that, they too have a code of right and wrong, and the only way to really access that and to show them that you're okay is to be straight up with them about who it is you are and what your agenda is, because they
Mm.
can smell. They have talk about instincts. Their instincts are to survive in that environment. Their instincts, if they're not completely drugged out, I would imagine these people were not,
Mm.
are very honed. And
Mhm.
so I cultivated a survival instinct by being myself and using the camera as a way of communicating with these people. And I got my first show in Los Angeles after the completion of that work. And the opening of that show was, I think, I can't remember the exact name of the organization. It might have been the Los Angeles Center for Photography, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up to get the exact name. But in any event, we hung the show the day that I got a unanimous verdict in a civil case for a client who was blind and who had been defrauded out of a lot of money by the defendants. Um, I remember that after I did that photography project, the skill that I had in relating to the people on the street for my own survival is exactly the skill set I used in addressing that jury and in
Mm.
communicating with the witnesses, even witnesses that were adverse to me. At the end of that trial, after we got the result, the defendants who I defeated, right, came up to me and said, I don't like the result, but you're one hell of a lawyer.
Mm.
Hmm.
And so I would say that that was when it got cemented in my mind. And that's a pretty early career story. I think I'd only been practicing 12 years at the time. But that incident, that those circumstances, that story of getting ready for that trial and doing this on the side project, shooting these homeless kids, really cemented in my mind the importance of these skills. These skills keep you alive on a very basic level. And These skills get you results for other people, and they're
Mm.
just incredibly powerful. They were the exact same skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I appreciate this wonderful story, and thank you for sharing. But going back to those two women, they recognized your humanity, which is the word we used earlier on when you were talking about your client in the hallway with the jurors. So I think that connection, which leads us to a curious question, the power lab. Now that we got to meet you in more than one level, I think it's time for you to just share a little bit about what your power lab is.
Thank you so very much. The Power Lab.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where do I start to describe the Power Lab? So here's the thing. Most lawyers, for example, lawyers, I don't want to speak to students in business school because my experience through Wharton is really shifting my understanding of
Mm.
the type of education that's now being offered in these finer institutions to people who want to have careers going into the corporate environment. But I can speak for lawyers who get a traditional law school education. We are taught a Socratic method of analyzing cases. We're very much in our head. The law schools have to prepare us to take the bar. So that is cramming your head with all kinds of knowledge on all different types of legal topics. But what we don't get, well, let me first say what we do get is we have to be an advocate. We have to serve our clients. We have to zealously advocate for our clients. We have to argue, make legal arguments, analyze the cases and make legal arguments. Nobody teaches us how to persuade or influence. It's completely absent from a standard law school education. And in my opinion, you can have bad facts, you can have bad law, and you can still win your case if you know
Mm.
how to be a good storyteller. Forget about the story. That's a whole other piece. But the human that you are when you're speaking and telling a story, I think you can even tell a terrible story and be a decent human and still win, right? I know because that's been my experience. I
Okay.
don't get the great cases. I get the crazy cases that no sane lawyer would take. So I'm here to tell you, you can have bad facts, bad law, and still win a case if you know how to reach the hearts of the people that you want
Mm.
to influence. So, did that answer your question? I'm not
I
sure I
hope so.
finished,
I don't
but
think it's
because it's
ever
a
finished, but yeah.
power lab sessions. Okay, so that's what that's the segue. Okay, the connection. We are taught to argue and not persuade, but what it takes to persuade is a whole other skill set that we also get no training on. It's expected we're going to go through law school and come out and be absolutely brilliant and
Mm.
perfect. And that's an insane expectation that we put on ourselves, right? I mean, they do call it the practice of law for a reason, right? But as high performers and high achievers, we have these incredibly high expectations of ourselves that we're going to just like step into the courtroom and be brilliant, right? And save the day. And I believe that needs to be disputed and addressed. And people need a skill set to be able to be powerful and influential and persuasive. And there's the social and the psychological and the physiological piece of us as humans that we need to be addressed and take care of and nurture in order to be our most influential and persuasive and therefore powerful when we enter
Mm.
into these situations where we are advocating and very serious issues are on the line for other people. So, this is what we do in the Power Lab. We focus on how do we manage the stress? How do we manage the physiological sensations so that we can speak from our hearts while thinking on our feet? That's the skill that I try to um, teach or show my clients or my students rather, so that they can access these parts of themselves and they have greater confidence and greater ease when it's their turn to actually get up and speak under situations where there's a lot of conflict. Maybe you have a loser, you're afraid of being judged, you want to be perfect. The consequences of not getting your way are terrifying for you and for your client. All of this, if you're in contact with any of these ideas, all of this is going to influence how you feel when you're presenting, and your feeling about how you're presenting and how you're doing is going to have everything to do with how well you do when you're
Hmm.
actually doing it. So that's what we do in the Power Lab. We uncover where are we stuck when it comes to what our blocks are about communicating, and how do we deal with the fight, flight, fear response that naturally comes up in our bodies, so that we're not disabled by it. So we don't want to just run out of the room when that's not an option, or freeze and forget what we have to say, because everybody dreads that, right? It's just absolutely awful to think that we might stumble and fumble or just completely lose our train of thought. So
Mm.
this is what we do in the Power Lab. We work on this, and we work with our own personal bias against being powerful. A lot of people have blocks about, I want to be powerful. We have a cultural bias against people who want to be powerful. We assume that they are immoral and ruthless and cruel, and that's
Mm.
not necessarily so. So this is what we work with. All of these topics, we address them in the Power Lab sessions.
Wow. It's fascinating.
Great.
Where can people learn more about that if they're interested in finding out more? Is that your website?
Yes, jenniferbgardner.com.
Great. That's easy
Yeah.
enough. And
Yeah.
that will
See,
be
and you'll find it in the notes.
exactly. You will find that in the notes for sure and more. We're getting to the end of our time here. Is there anything else, Julienne, that you wanted to comment on or ask a question about?
There's always questions, but I think you gave us a very rich overview, and I'm just looking forward to learning more about this method. And I'm thinking about how many people the power of influence is so important. We know good intent, but the power of the ask and getting people to really embrace that and be a game changer, can do a
Yeah.
lot of good.
Yeah.
Exactly.
For
Mhm.
sure. And I really appreciate the way in this interview your own experiences are kind of mirrored by your description of what people will learn in the Power Lab. So it's all of these things that you described, you went through yourself, and what you learned through these experiences and all these different things that you've studied and learned about. It sounds like that is all being used in the Power Lab. And I love to hear that, because that's kind of walking the talk of this idea of
Yeah,
bringing your true
absolutely.
self that we talked about, and authenticity. You really do walk the talk. So thanks very much for that. Really appreciate you for showing up today with these great stories as well. And yeah, really look forward to seeing what happens next, and hopefully we'll be in touch again, because this is
I
fascinating
hope
work.
so. It
Yeah.
really
Thank you,
is. And
Jennifer. Thank you.
thank you so much for having me. And thank you both for the work that you do. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas with your audience. I'm really grateful.
Oh, well, wonderful, wonderful. Well, speaking of our audience, I want to thank our audience as well for listening and tuning in today, and to remind you that if you've been inspired by this session, and especially when we talked about our own methodology of narrative of listening and storytelling, you can consider enrolling yourself in one of our programs, whether that's one-on-one or group trainings for your organization or individually. We focus on leadership development, sales, team building, as well as onboarding and employee engagement. You can go to narrative.com to enroll and find out more. We're always ready to listen to you, right, Julienne?
Yes, absolutely. Tell us a story, and we'll be there to support you and how you can use it and get things really productive in your
Yeah.
workplace.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And so, once again, thanks for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review wherever you find your podcast, and also go to our YouTube channel. All of this drives the word of mouth, and we can get more people to benefit from the wisdom of people like Jennifer. So, really, thank you again for listening and spreading the word. Until next time, and thanks, Julienne, for co-hosting with
Thank
me.
you. All right. See you soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.